Okay, I know Adrian has a lot of content to cover, so I think we're just going to jump right in because I think he's going to use every second of the hour. Like I said, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christina Caesar, and I manage marketing and communications at Synergy Technical, and I have the honor of introducing today's speaker and moderating today's session. Today's webinar will explore the latest Microsoft product family, the Microsoft Entra suite, and how to use these tools within your organization to secure identities and access. Just a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and please drop any questions or comments in the Q&A function within Teams. If it will let me go to the next slide, I could tell you about Synergy. Adrian, can you help me get over?
Yeah, I got you.
We're still figuring out that, taking control. Thanks. Anyway, just a little bit about us. Synergy Technical is an IT consulting firm headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. We have clients in over 70 countries in all 50 states and manage over 3 million licenses of Microsoft 365 for our clients through our licensing and managed services practice. And a large part of that success is due to our amazing presenter, Adrian Amos. Adrian is one of our top solution architects with specializations in both productivity and security solutions. He's had the honor of running both productivity and security immersion experiences at Microsoft Ignite, as well as lead work sessions with clients all over the world. Recently, you could find him all over our social media working on all of his new video content and talk tracks, which I think secretly is like his passion. And with that, Adrian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and that speedy introduction, so we can get things off, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you, Christina. All right, so in order to discuss Entra, Microsoft's new identity and access management unified solution, we have to first begin with a discussion of what even is identity. What constitutes the elements of our identity, and what is it that we need to worry about protecting? So in kind of the earliest traditional senses of managing identity at a corporate level, we're talking about a credential pair, right? We're talking about a username and a password. And we're going to get into how there's a little bit more to it than that, obviously. But, just like last time when we talked about with Purview, the history of compliance, we actually talked there about the origins of identity, like civilization-wise, how we first began to recognize the need to be able to codify identity, be able to present identity to satisfy certain requirements between us and our governments, right? In the earliest days, this was jewelry and identification tattoos. It became crowns. It became, prestigious robes and tartans, and passports began to show up. And we started to move into more of a numerical systems where we have things like social security numbers, and moving into photographic IDs, moving all the way forward into fingerprints and biometrics, right? But whereas last time we started going into how that was an impact from a compliance perspective, we're really not worried about that in this particular sense. Right now, we're worried about what that identity, what that set of attributes opens up to our work and to our relationship with our governments, right? From a work perspective, our identity is going to be a set of attributes that allows us to present certain facts about ourselves to our internal systems to gain access to things. It is both the attributes that define who we are and the attributes that define our access to our systems. And this is actually going to be important later as we come back, is this recognition that we're dealing with both identity and access kind of all at the same time through these attributes. And this is where Microsoft has made a concerted effort over the last 30 plus years to recognize that identity and access management are part and parcel of the same thing. When you separate those two things, you are actually introducing risk. You're introducing layers between systems that then need additional levels of protection. But when we put those two things together, when we put identity and access management into the same system, we are saying that all of these requirements can be satisfied without having to move, ship, or transfer or process data across other layers, which means we're actually reducing our security footprint, which is always a good thing. So this set of attributes, right, whatever these attributes may be, traditionally, if we're looking at it from a work perspective, is going to say, what's your name, what's your department, what's your job title, who do you report to, what groups are you a member of? In a citizenship perspective, it's going to be things like, what's your social security number, what are the benefits that you're entitled to through whatever particular government programs you may have access to. But identity tends to get a lot bigger than that, and it does it in a hurry, right? In our modern world, we're dealing with a lot of identity sprawl. And we all can be, found in most of these systems. And actually, some of these slides actually date back over 2 years ago to when we first discussed decentralized identity and where the industry was going with this. But the simple fact is that these things are still true. Most of us are represented across most of these disparate systems. And in all of these systems, we have a separate set of identities, right? There are attributes that these organizations or these companies have collected, they're managing for us, and they exist to expose a set of statements, factual presentations. You could call them credentials, you could call them accesses, whatever it is you want to do. This is the purpose. We have these identities in all of these systems to do the same thing, to expose a set of attributes that is then used to either give us access to something or prevent us gaining access to something. In many cases, we expose this, I mentioned this thing about having disparate systems of identity. In a lot of cases, we don't have control over these attributes as they exist in these systems. And that's where a lot of risk comes in, not just from the perspective of from the managing from the corporate side, but also from a user side. I can't decide when my financial services organization is allowed to tell someone that I owe them money. I don't have access to that. That's information that they've collected about me, and they may have some sort of legal standing or right to share that data in a way that I'm not comfortable with. So by allowing all these disparate systems to have a copy of my identity, because that's what they are, they're all little digital versions of me, I am giving up control. You as a company are giving up control. You're allowing people to have pieces and bits of information about themselves that are in various places that you may or may not have access to, and that malicious behaviors may be trying to leverage. So if identity is more than work and citizenship, it is this combination of all of the things that we do, we really need to have some fundamental protections around this concept, right? And part of what we're doing here when we start talking about the way Microsoft has aligned identity and access management is that we're saying, listen, I recognize that we have a need to create identities for our internal users as an ongoing element of how we've traditionally managed things. But I also recognize that my users should have more control of those aspects of identity that are presented to various disparate systems. And so what we partially want to do with this is we want to allow users to have a little bit more autonomy in the identity that they use, both to come into our systems and the identity as they use it to present to other systems. Because even though we talked about the identity sprawl earlier, it's actually much, much worse, right? At any one given moment, there could be dozens, if not hundreds, of digital representations of every single one of us. And every time we leave a job and start a new job, we're creating more digital representations of ourselves. And as we leave those positions and as we move forward in our careers, we don't really have any say over what happens in that space. Now, in other countries, that may be less true. We have, GDPR in Europe with the right to forget. So we have to recognize that we exist in multiple places, going back to the purview conversation from last month, but we also need to be able to exercise more control. And I frankly think what we want to do is we want to have fewer versions of ourselves. We as administrators want to be responsible for less data, right? It's a good thing when we have less data to maintain. But we can do a lot with the data that we decide strategically to choose to use. So we also showed this slide last month, right, in the purview discussion, talking about how in a traditional sense, we might have some core requirements of things that we needed to do from a compliance perspective. And on the left side, we might have things that we would be able to do in an on-premises environment. On the right side, we're going to start with that same list of choices. And the same is true in identity management, right? Identity and access management, I should say. Whether we're doing it if we're doing it on premises, we're going to be able to decide that there are certain attributes that we have to protect. There are certain ways that we have to present credentials to systems. There are going to be certain protocols that we can choose to use, but we're going to be fundamentally limited, and we're not going to be able to do things like identity protections, where we're looking at graph data for what are credential pairs that are exposed out in the wild and pull that in and leverage it against what are anomalous behaviors in disconnected systems that might tell us things about how our users and how our identities may be compromised and how those compromises can exist at scale. We simply can't do that with on-premises traditional systems. And when we move to the cloud approach, we automatically get this cloud provider responsibilities, things that are simply done for us, which allows us to move up the stack, worry about things that are more important. Then we can decide, hey, because of those things, we can actually get this other really cool stuff here. And again, just like we talked about with Purview, all these systems are going to be interconnected, and I'm going to get identity signals from my users across dozens, if not hundreds, if not even thousands of SaaS applications, on-premises environments, multi-cloud environments, my actual connected internal applications, my Office telemetry, my Sentinel telemetry, my Defender telemetry, all that's going to come together and tell me what's actually happening, how these small sets of attributes that define my digital identities are being leveraged to gain access to the systems that I care about. So with all that said and done, here we go. We're going to talk about the new thing, right? Microsoft Entra. Microsoft has been really big on renaming products, but not by individual small products, but by family, right? So we got Purview, we got Priva for the privacy controls, we got Viva for the work-life balance things, and now we have Entra. Entra is going to be all things identity and access management. And whereas with Purview, we didn't get any new products, and we certainly didn't get any new dashboards, with Entra, we actually get both. We get a whole new dashboard that I don't know if it's fully intended to replace the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, but we'll show that in a second. But it is certainly where almost all of the identity controls are now landing. And I did say almost all on purpose. There are a couple of things that seem to be dying on the vine potentially, right? And we can cover those in a little bit, but the goal here is to understand that almost all of our identity controls are now going to roll up into this one dashboard where we're going to have all of our Azure Active Directory capabilities from the free version all the way up through to Azure Active Directory P2, because even though we're realigning tools, just like with Purview, we're not relicensing tools, right? This is just a realignment for the Azure Active Directory space. But whereas with Purview, we didn't get any fundamental new tools. With Entra, we're getting both permissions management, which is Microsoft's Cloud CIEM solution, which is Cloud Infrastructure and Entitlement Management, or Cloud Permissions Management, which came from the acquisition of Cloud Knox last year. And we're also getting this verified ID capability. And this is actually where I pulled some of my previous identity slides talking from a conference 2 years ago about the future of decentralized identity. And at the time, there was no product in this space from Microsoft, but there is now, and I'm super excited about it. I don't have a working demo of it in this environment yet. It is in preview. It does require a little bit of bolt-on action. So we'll get into that in a little bit, and we'll talk about what is supported in the preview and where I think the technology is going. But before we get there, I did mention that there was this Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and this is still around. It's not gone. It may not even be going away, but this is solely focused on the Azure AD side of things, right? So whereas the Entra dashboard is all things Entra, this is principally just the Azure AD side. So without any further ado, let's actually jump in and we'll talk about what the identity and access management components of Azure Active Directory are, how we're going to protect those attributes, and what we're going to be able to do with them. So I'm here live in my my demo environment. I have my Entra dashboard. I have my overview that's actually pretty useful overview, right? It's going to bring up information about the number of users and groups and applications and devices. It's going to give me any alerts to things that are coming up in my environment. It's got monitoring capabilities that are surfaced right up here too. I can see things like sign-in levels, right? If I want to look at properties about how my environment is managed, I've got all that information, tutorials here, setup guides, even getting started with passwordless authentication, right? It's just baked right in here, getting started with things. And then there's also training. And this is kind of a big area that Microsoft has invested in. If you look at Teams, if you go down to the bottom left-hand corner in Teams and Help, there's actually a lot of great training information. And if we go back to the conversations that we've had over the last several months about security.microsoft.com and compliance.microsoft.com, there's generally areas that are how to get started with these tool sets. So, you know, this is a great investment. It's super easy to get started and find out what we're looking for. But all of that said, identity in our in our corporate environments is going to basically boil down to users and groups. And those users and groups are going to be composed of various attributes that we're going to use to then give our users access to things, right? And this is where Azure Active Directory has gotten really powerful over the years. I've been doing Active Directory since it was in its preview days, and it was a long time coming before we got the ability to do anything meaningful with attributes. In the past, in the traditional sense, before Server 2012, I want to say, our collection of attributes was really just a majestically beautiful phone book that exposed us to all sorts of compliance risks. With Azure Active Directory, if I dig into these attributes, I've actually got some really useful information that's surfaced up to my users here about my users, right? I can do profile pictures that are so much easier to manage, and I can actually give my users the authority to update these profile pictures themselves. I can actually turn over responsibility for some of these attributes to my users. It's fantastic. But we collect all of this information, all of these attributes here, and I can actually pull these things from on-premises too. So if we have an Active Directory that we're pulling data from, we can absolutely synchronize our users. And while we don't get 100% of all the attributes from the on-premises schema, the reality is some of those attributes don't really matter. We can pull in all of the custom attributes, the extension attributes that have existed as a result of implementations of Exchange on-premises for years. So all of our extension attributes 1 through 15 come over, and we can actually also create custom attributes just for our Azure AD. So we've got all this information here, right? We can see who our user is. We've got job title information, department information, employee type, hire date, org date, and we can actually synchronize some of this stuff too to external third-party HR systems. So we can have our identity pulling from sources of truth and sources of authority. We can decide this is either one of those things. We can actually push that data out through single sign-on application integrations out to thousands of additional SaaS applications. So I can take the identity of this combination of attributes that defines this user, and I can push those attributes out without needing ADFS, without needing to build up any of that certificate authority or any of that stuff that went into traditional environments where we were doing things attribute based, right? All of my attributes that I have for all of my users can be used to define their membership in groups through dynamic groups, because while group membership has been a traditional critical component of how we define access to systems, we had been traditionally constrained to static groups. You put a user in a group, the user gains access to the resource, right? Well, we're not constrained to that anymore. We can build groups that are dynamic. We can have those dynamic groups be based on any one of dozens of attributes, including, and I can't show it to you because it doesn't actually get surfaced here, but I can make a dynamic group here, and I can go in and define the query of the dynamic properties to choose, or the attributes to choose from, and I can actually even choose member of, which means that for the first time in history, I actually have support for nested groups as a dynamic groups, which is so crazy cool, right? If I want to just add a user to a particular department and then that department's membership gives them access to other things dynamically, we can do that. That's really super awesome. And as of just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we can now actually take these groups that we have created in the Azure Active Directory and synchronize them back to on-premises through Azure Active Directory group write-back capability. And this is really super cool. So we can create security groups that don't get Teams enabled by default. We can create Microsoft 365 groups that do get presented with Microsoft resources. We can give the groups, names and roles. We can actually even assign Azure Active Directory roles. So is this an administrator? What is the parameters by which this account is allowed, or this group is allowed to gain access to privileged identities and privileged roles within Azure Active Directory. We can define role owners, we can define groups, we can come in here and define what are the roles that are going to be assigned to this. And what's even crazy cooler than this is that I can decide that these roles should be assigned on a just-in-time basis. So I can actually take roles, give them to groups, and then come down into privileged identity management and decide that these users should only be able to gain access to these roles through membership in these groups on a time constrained basis. And that means that I am no longer in Azure Active Directory doing point user work. And that's my term, not Microsoft's term. But it's been a constraint that we've had to operate within for years, where if I want to give a user a thing, I had to assign the user directly to the resource. Well, Microsoft has made some big strides in really exposing groups back out to our control and access control planes. And that's been really powerful, because what it allows us to do is define things like privileged access groups. And this is just exactly that. If I've got a help desk and everybody on the help desk needs to have the same privilege elevation, but it may contain 4 groups or 4 roles that they need to have to do their job. With privileged identity management traditionally, which by the way is the coolest thing in the world, where users can see what their administrative roles are that they currently own, and they can see the roles that they're eligible to own, and they can go through an approval process that grants them that access for a period of time, which can actually result in like a 99% reduction in your administrative attack surface, which is like super crazy cool. We can actually do that at a group level though, right? And if we do that to the group and we put them in the help desk group, and the help desk group gets not just the authentication administrator role, but they also get the Intune administrator role, and they also get the XYZ role, and whatever. They can go through one approval request to get all those roles. It's time bound. At the end of that time bound, they lose the access. They go back to being regular users. And you can't even query through LDAP or any equivalent control surface to see who would have these roles, because it doesn't appear to exist. It's not like Active Directory, where once the is-admin attribute gets flipped, they're an admin forever, right? This is not that. This is truly just-in-time elevation to do their job. It's all tracked. We can see who's using their roles, and then we can take these users, these groups, these attributes, and these role type things, and we can build them into access packages. We can actually take organizations and join them together, surface up what we call catalogs of resources that belong to a particular department or to a particular project or whatever. And we can say, hey, look, there's this IT catalog, right? If you're in the IT department, you're going to have access potentially to any one of these access packages. And these access packages are going to contain some of these resources, right? So we've got applications, we've got dynamic groups, we've got sites and teams, and we've got roles that are assignable, and we've got all these cool things that we can do. And we can, I add these to these particular users or to these particular groups. And we can even define that if we're going to have some of these things where maybe they shouldn't be assignable to the same person, we can actually build in separation of duties too. So we can say, listen, if you're going to have the CIO role, you cannot also have the compliance officer role. And what's really cool about the way that users gain access to these roles is they simply go to myaccess.microsoft.com. They see a list of roles that are available for them to request, and they hit request. And then we can build in these crazy, super awesome approval processes that are 1, 2, or even 3 levels deep of who's allowed to get request the access, how long the access remains. Are there built-in access reviews to guarantee that users don't hold on to these roles for longer than they should be able to? Are we allowing anybody to even currently request it, right? Is this available only for people in our internal environment, or are we accepting guests into our internal roles? Now, this is one of my favorite things, right? Because maybe what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we're not gonna hire people internal anymore. We're going to outsource our sales pack, our sales people, right? So maybe what we could actually do, and I don't have it in this environment, but we can actually build an external list or an external job role and present it out to people to present their external identities to, so that they actually log in with the credential that they already have that comes from a connected organization that we've already decided to trust and do business with. And then we can actually nominate external sponsors in their organization. So maybe I want to say like, hey, I want to bring in 50 contractors to build this particular website, right? I don't really need to know the names and the whole background of every single one of them. I just need the website built. And I want it built by, let's say, Synergy Technical, right? So when I build this role that says work on my website, and I give them the roles and the accesses and everything to that job type, to that access package, I can then allow members from Synergy Technical to request that package, and I don't have to vet each and every one of them. I'm going to nominate a sponsor there to be responsible for knowing who they are, what their history is, what it is they're supposed to be doing. And when they approve it, it then comes over the fence into my side to have an internal sponsor say, well, if that guy vetted it, I'm good to vet it. They can have the access, and it's 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is later, we can have it automatically disabled. And what's even cooler than that is if it is an external member, we can actually say, hey, if this external user loses this access package and they currently have no other standing access packages, disable the account. And then if it's been disabled for more than 30 days, delete it, because we don't need to hold on to external identities. So there's so much that we can do with all this, but then there's actually even more, because we can start defining how we want to protect not just our users, but also the accesses that they gain. Because remember, we're doing access at the same time as identity, right? We're not shipping our identities out to some other third-party system to have access determinations made. We're doing all of that with this set of attributes, with this set of controls. And so we can decide things like if we see a user that's doing risky activities, maybe they're exposing their credentials in weird ways. Maybe they're doing things like, authenticating from two places that are geographically impossible distance to travel in a too short a period of time. Maybe we're seeing really crazy things like, they're not meeting our MFA requirements, or they're doing all kinds of weird stuff. We can actually say, hey, we're not going to let you into our systems based on this set of identity, or we can actually take in conditions around the applications themselves, take in conditions around defining terms of use that our users have to agree to, and then we can keep that and reference that they've agreed to it. We can even enforce that terms of use be reapplied at every different device login. And we can also take in other controls that are coming from across the Microsoft 365 space to say, is a device marked as compliant? Is a device Azure AD joined? Is a device managed in Intune? Is it up to date with all these applications that we need? And if it's not, do I allow it in? Do I allow it in but block downloads so that I can't have data leave? What level of access do I want to allow my users to do? And with all of that, I have wonderful reporting and capabilities, and to view not just how my policies are affecting users, but are my policies actually made right? Are they affecting anything? So I can actually see all of my enabled policies. I can dig down through and see specifically if I have policies that are set to report only. So we can actually build our policies in a way that they are actually not taking impact, but they are logging. So we can see what's going to be the impact when I turn this guy on. And then we can define all kinds of crazy cool stuff about how our users are actually able to authenticate, right? Because, we've been talking about how identity dates back to the credential pair, the username and password, but we can move beyond that. We can do FIDO keys. We can do Microsoft Authenticator. We can do text message, where actually a user is responding to a text message. And this is going to be important for some frontline worker scenarios, but in general, you don't really want to do this with your back office workers. We can do temporary access pass too, so that the first run experience of logging into a brand new device can be truly zero touch. We can have a device drop ship to a user, let Intune and Autopilot manage the initial setup of it, have the user do their initial authentication with a temporary access pass. We can then also allow users to do their own password resets. And what's crazy here is from time to time, will still hear other vendors say today that Microsoft doesn't enable or doesn't allow users to do self-service password reset. And that is absolutely not true. We can allow our users to do self-service password reset. We can define what the registration is that users have to go through, how long they're able to delay it. We can actually do on-premises integration with things. And then we can actually, we're going to be constrained to, our administrators are going to have a higher bar to clear in order to do their own password resets. So we absolutely can do all of that. And I did mention that we have the ability to integrate with external identities. And we can do cross-tenant so that we can recognize all Microsoft identities and allow our environment to consume their multi-factor statements, right? Is this user authenticated through multi-factor? Yes, well then let them in, and we can do that across the board, we can actually define what are organizations that we simply don't want our users interacting with. We can allow external identity providers like Facebook and Google and other SAML federations. So we can do all of this really cool stuff, but this is only the beginning, right? Because so far, all of this is really functionally internal. But we're moving toward this idea where decentralized identity is being recognized as part of the future. And I mentioned that with our identity governance, with our access packages and our entitlement management, that we can consume external identity. I absolutely believe, and I have believed since 2019 when I first had a conversation with Microsoft engineers in Redmond about this, that they're building this set of capabilities to consume decentralized authentication mechanisms, which frankly don't exist yet. We're 3 years later and they frankly don't exist yet in a meaningful capacity. But the fact that Microsoft has a decentralized identity product now in the Entra space, and that we can consume third-party identity as part of how we allow users to leverage and access our systems, tells me this is absolutely the future. All right, so Azure AD, right? We've covered a lot. If you want to get deeper into how some of these things work, we've covered that in other scenario or in other discussions, and I'm sure we'll circle back as things get more powerful. But I want to come back and talk about permissions management, right? Microsoft's CIEM CPM solution. So to understand what that is and how it works, we have to understand first what CIEM and CPM are. They are Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, pronounced CIEM, and I apologize for the missing parenthesis, or cloud permissions management. These terms are interchangeable. They both have ties to specific organizations, and those specific organizations have reasons to want you to believe that their version is better, but they are really the same thing. What they recognize, though, or what they do, what they represent, is a realization that there is a market-driven need to be able to secure multi-cloud. And not just secure from like a Defender for Cloud perspective where you can go in and define policies, but we actually want to do permissions management, right? So this goes back to identity and access management. And all the things that we just talked about with privilege identity management and access packages and entitlement management, we're now taking those sets of policies and expanding them into multi-cloud solution, right? So whether it's Azure, AWS, GCP, we're going to be able to look at what's going on, define access environment, or define access, and actually start to take control over it. And CloudKnox was the pioneer in the market. They were founded in 2016, acquired by Microsoft in 2021, and it was the approach of market readiness or general availability that I think is kind of what kicked the Entra name and the realignment into high gear, but it became generally available on July 7 of this year. And when they took it GA, if you used it in preview, you did not have the ability to do automated onboarding. Well, now we actually do, and it actually works pretty well. You know, some of the first recognizer, or some of the first to recognize the need to do like radar reports, like total economic impact reports, those sorts of things. Omdia, it seems to be the first one out there, and they are saying that Entra/CloudKnox is the clear leader in the category in their 2022 CPM market radar report. So marketing aside, right? What does it do? It gives us the ability to discover every action taken by every identity across every resource across multi-cloud, assess permissions risk, and report unused permissions. Now, I didn't show you earlier, but privilege identity management actually does exactly the same thing in Azure AD. If I am over provisioned for roles and I'm not using those roles, there's a dashboard that I can gain access to that will show me, hey, you have too many users who are assigned this role and they're not using it, right? Or they have stale credentials and they have this role. Well, now, not only are we consuming that information, but now we're also monitoring on an ongoing basis. We've said, hey, there are over provisioned systems, but we want to look for anomalous usage over time. We want to do detailed forensics reporting that can be surfaced up into other systems so that we can build our incident responses if something goes wrong. And then we want to be able to remediate with these tool sets in place. It's not good enough to just discover and monitor anymore, right? All of our tool sets that are going to do anything meaningful for us need to be able to do They need to have the security workload, they need to have the analytics, and they need to have automated incident responses. And that's where this becomes really powerful, right? So we're actually going to be able to identify those permissions gaps and close them programmatically, be able to define policies to help drive principles of least access based on actual usage, and allow, just like with privileged identity management, users to request access to things to be able to do their job and know that those requests are going to automatically expire so that we're not leaving big permissions gaps open for anybody to just take advantage of. So what this all looks like is a pretty simple dashboard, right? And my environment is tragically small. I don't have any AWS. I don't have any GCP. I have a very small Azure environment, and it has just a very small number of people who are defined as administrators. But you can see they're already massively over provisioned. But we're going to get, just kind of at our dashboard level, we're going to get this permission creep index. What are my risks right now? What are my identity risks? What are my resource risks? And what do I need to start thinking about? We're going to be able to move that into this analytics dashboard, where we're going to be able to drill down into any one of these identities across any one of these subtypes and states, and all this fun stuff. And as we dig down into this is all drill down, drill through, drill across. There's lots of information that's in here. We're going to be able to see, what is causing this permission creep index to go up. Generally, the bigger the number, the worse the score. We're gamifying everything. We've talked in the past about secure score for identities and for Microsoft 365. This is kind of like that, except that generally in those cases you want a bigger number. Here you want a smaller number. But so we have our analytics. We can drill down and see what are the things that our users are actually doing in this space. And then we can actually dig into remediations, where we can look at roles and policies and build policies back to allow us to programmatically identify and remove permissions. On this dashboard, we can also come over and recognize that we want to revoke unused rights and risks and tasks and things that shouldn't be exposed. I will caution you that when you turn this on in your environment, you will find things that are alarming, and that's by design, right? We want to know what are the things that users just sort of took as an access for themselves and held on to for a long time. We're going to have an audit capability. It's going to be based on a very similar looking KQL structure that we're familiar with from the security.microsoft.com side. We're going to be able to go back through and find actions and behaviors and things that have been going on. We're going to get a whole lot of reporting that's coming out of this. And again, just like with the other dashboards here too, all this information we can drill down, drill into, get information about what's actually going on in our environment, and we can turn these reports back around into actionable and meaningful insights. So there's a lot that's going on there, and I wanted to save a little bit of time to talk about the verified ID, right? So Microsoft's first foray into decentralized identity. Now, I did say I do not have a working demo of this in my environment. I'll cover why in a moment, but this is one of the few things that, again, in preview, you cannot fully light up without reliance on some additional external system. Okay, so Entra verified ID, right? We've talked about how identity is this superset of all of these things that represent who you are across multiple disparate systems. And the challenge is that in many of these situations, you don't actually own these attributes, right? And in classic identity models and centralized identity models, right, we are working with a master or root identity provider that houses the identities which users leverage to verify claims and access files and systems, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We have federation, where we're saying, I still own the attributes and this guy over here can gain access to them to verify. But what we want to be able to do, as I mentioned earlier, is actually really allow the users to decide when and where to present which elements of their identity are necessary to do the thing that they need to do. What this really allows us to do is put responsibility for identity management back into the hands of the users. And I promise you, that's actually a very good thing. It's a little bit scary, but it's actually a very good thing, because from the compliance perspective for Purview last month, the less information we have about users, the less risk we have to manage on their behalf. But in this situation, what we're doing is we're going to give the ability for users to have one or more decentralized identities. We're going to allow those identities to be resolved across multiple chains, whether they're public chains like Bitcoin and blockchain and all that kind of fun stuff, or if they're going to be private ledgers. We're going to give users the ability to decide, when they want to present these things, how they want to present these things, and we're going to give our company the ability to simply prove that the statement is true. Essentially, what we're allowing the user to do is make claims about themselves, attestations, and we're simply verifying the attestation. And we're giving user consent is now a critical element of this. We're making sure that users are required to consent to the presentation of any specific set of attributes, which is super, super powerful, right? I don't want my full list of 75 attributes to be exposed if all I'm trying to do is say, I am a student here, so please give me a discount at the bookstore, right? So what this ends up looking like is remarkably complicated, but it's really not all that complicated. We're going to have these distributed systems, these blockchains, ledgers, however we want to do it. We're going to give the user some sort of meaningful way to present an authentication or an identity out to external folks. And what this ends up looking like is we're going to have a couple of things happening, right? We're going to have separate issuance and status checking across these organizations. So if I have my user that says, I want to present that I am an employee at Contoso to Fabricam, whatever reason, maybe Fabricam is the bookstore, Contoso is the company or is the college, then Fabricam is going to look over here and verify the entitlement and allow the user to then present their prove their attestation so that they can say, I am actually a student. I want to buy my books at the bookstore. And what that then allows us to do for that user is take up all of these things that define who they are and what they are, and they're going to put them in their control inside the little application, Microsoft Authenticator, right? And what they're going to then get is a whole series of cards, but basically they're going to say, I want to have this credential. You as a company will produce a credential that says current student or current employee or current member of this department or whatever it is that you want them to be able to prove. They will then be able to add that as a card in their Authenticator app. And when they need to produce that presentation to some additional company, they will be able to simply show the card, biometrically unlock it, or however it is that we choose to do with it. That third party will then check back against our public statement or our public attestation that that statement is true, and the user will be able to go on about their business. This can be health information exposed for EMTs to be able to know what your current allergies are. This can be insurance information. This can be all sorts of cool stuff, whether it's, citizenship wise, whether it's corporate wise, whether it's all these other like third-party identity sprawl components that we've been talking about. We are giving control of how to manage and consent to all these requests back to the user. And the way this works in our Entra space is we're going to have a couple of things, right? We have to have an organization name, we have to have a public website, and we have to have a key vault. Now, the two things that we don't get by default here when we just turn things on, you don't get a key vault. That's an Azure component, right? It's not very complicated. You can actually just go through the process of defining your key vault right here. But you cannot do this build out until you actually have a public website where you can host a JSON file. And that's not hard, but I don't have one because it turns out that a public website is one of the few things that you actually don't get in Microsoft 365 by default. So I don't have a working demo of this. I'm hoping to have a working demo of it very soon. I'm going to have to build a website, and I haven't done that since probably 1997. So, be firing up Notepad and working through that. So that's where we are going. I firmly believe that we are moving toward a point where we are going to be able to either issue or accept or both decentralized authentication, where we as a human being, when we move from job to job, can simply say, I own my own identity. I'm going to come work at Contoso. I'm going to bring my existing identity with my attributes and how to pay me. And when I leave Contoso, I'm going to take those attributes away, sever the rights for you to see those things, and then we can go on about our business and never be worse for wear. That's what I got for you today. Happy to open it up to any questions you may have. I want to thank you for joining me.
Awesome job, Adrian. I'm glad that you got through it because we've got a good amount of questions to go through.
Awesome.
First and foremost, though, thank you. That was great. So will Microsoft provide templates to apply for segregation of duty requirements for SOX, NIST, ISO, et cetera, around compliance?
That's a really good question. And actually, I don't really know because what we're doing is I can't imagine it would be possible yet. And I say that because when we start building our access packages, that's all information that's internal and unique to us. We decide what those access packages are. We decide what are the resources that are parts of those access packages. My guess is that you're going to see organizations that are not going to align it to job roles. You're going to see organizations that may align things differently. So it would be very difficult for Microsoft to impose those. I think what we might end up seeing, though, is some third-party documentation around how best to align these things. But I like that idea a lot, and I think that that's going to be a pretty important part of defining how these separation of duties requirements work, is to align them to those requirements. But again, they're all your internal resources and job descriptions.
Nice. All right. What kinds of objects can be written back to AD from Azure AD? Since AD is flat, how do you control where those objects are created?
Yeah, so I didn't spend a lot of time talking about Azure AD Connect. We do and have had the ability to synchronize Active Directory objects to Azure Active Directory forever. Actually, I think going back all the way to like 2010 when we first got DirSync. And for a long time, really the only attributes you could really write back reliably were passwords. We started to see some other attributes being written back, and then eventually we saw device write back coming in. But even that is generally managed inside of other workloads, right? So if you're doing something like Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365, you're determining what OU to write your devices back into Active Directory. But Microsoft did just announce a couple of weeks ago that we now have group write back support. And they went through a couple of quick iterations of that because initially it was all or nothing. You either get all of your groups written back or you don't get any. They just framed up a new checkbox that allows you to decide whether or not a group is appropriate for write back. Those groups, you're going to choose at a global level where they get written back to. So you're going to choose an OU during synchronization in Azure AD Connect. And then all of those groups are going to come back as universal groups. And I actually had some questions around why universal at first, but because Microsoft is supporting the synchronization of a forest and not just the domain, it's pretty important that when we write objects back, we give them the ability to participate in the entire forest. So universal groups are why they landed on that. And we are not yet at a point where we can write back users, but I have seen some discussions around whether or not users should be provisioned from Azure Active Directory into Active Directory through AAD Connect. There are some more complicated third-party mechanisms for that, or even actually first-party, but much more complicated mechanisms that are bigger than Azure AD Connect. But it is something that has been on Microsoft's radar for some time. So you can absolutely do groups, you can absolutely do devices, you can absolutely do most attributes, though not all attributes go either way. But yeah, you're going to choose at the synchronization time where they're going to land in Active Directory.
Ooh, this one might be a loaded question. What is the licensing structure of permissions management?
Yeah, that is a little bit loaded. So, so interestingly, almost everything in the Microsoft 365 space is going to be per user per month. And in fact, if you go into the Microsoft Admin Center and you decide you want to light up Entra permissions management, you will be able to see the authority to light it up for a user, right? And there's a license fee for the user, but what it really ends up coming down to is licensed per resource per year. So we're deviating a little bit from both the terms and the structure, but it aligns a little bit more closely with what we see in Defender for Cloud. And there are some integrations between between Entra Permissions Management and Defender for Cloud. So I think what we're seeing is that alignment. I don't know the actual numbers for per resource per year, but I do know that's how it's aligned.
Well, I should have asked this question after the other Azure AD one because they're kind of similar. I thought Microsoft brought true passwordless authentication to Azure AD, so why are we still talking about credential pairs?
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna go back into my demo for a second here, and we're gonna talk a little bit about passwords. And actually, for this one, because I'm more familiar with the look, I'm going back to the AAD portal. So we have had the ability to define passwordless authentication for users for some time, but we are kind of restricted on how we're doing multi-factor authentication in terms of it is passwordless, but we still do have passwords in Azure AD. And of course, I said I remembered how to get here, but I'm already off the rails. Our users in Azure Active Directory have a password attribute. Users in Microsoft's consumer version of Azure AD can choose to not have a password attribute. That capability has not yet landed in Azure AD for corporations. So you still have a username, you still have a password, you then decide what passwordless controls you want to apply on top of that user. And that's where we can decide, you know, if we want to allow users to do YubiKeys or you know, even SMS authentication, right? We can go super crazy if we want to use the Authenticator app, if we want to use all these other things. Now, those capabilities mirror what exists in the consumer side, but in the corporate Azure AD, you still have a password attribute. And there are a lot of really awesome controls around how we can protect those attributes and that actually mirror similarly how we can do things in on-premises worlds where like we would set the smart card required, the Skrill bit, that would, you know, forcibly roll the password to like a 50-character value every single day. So the password can become less important, but it does still exist in Azure Active Directory today.
Good to know. So I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll give everyone another minute to drop them in, but while giving everyone a chance, thank you everyone for attending today. You will receive a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar by tomorrow. In the future, please be sure to keep up with us on social, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like I said, Adrian's been putting out a lot of great video content. Or check our events page for more upcoming webinars. And if you have any questions about the topics covered today, please just reach out to me and I will connect you with Adrian or the appropriate AE. And yeah, so thank you everyone for joining today. I'm not seeing any more questions, so hopefully we can give you back a few minutes in your day. But all right, thank you everyone.